Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
Vanessa, today's episode is about a topic that we never discuss. And we never discuss it because it's like the lowest hanging fruit topic ever. It's like the most basic of basic topics that so demands conversation. But I never thought to talk about it before this past few months. Did you?
No, I mean, to be even more specific, as we were preparing our health and sex ed curriculum for schools and we were reviewing state standards across all 50 states, making sure we had captured the kind of baseline lessons that every state requires, we kept coming up against a lesson or set of lessons called personal health. And we looked at each other across Zoom and we were like, oh my God.
We're like this. We're just looking at each other.
We're just looking at listeners. We're just staring at each other's Zoom squares. We were like, how have we never done a lesson on personal health? Like everything we do is about personal health and taking care of yourself and taking care of the kids in your life and keeping them healthy and safe. But we had never explicitly covered personal health. So we wrote that lesson.
I mean, it was like, I just want to back up and say it was like the physical embodiment of the facepalm emoji. That was the experience we both had. Like, oh my God, how have we never done a podcast about this, a newsletter about this? So
it's also like when you realize that you have never told a kid they have to use soap in the shower. And then you were like, I need to tell you to use soap in the shower. And as we were writing the lesson, we kept saying to each other, oh my God, this is so great. Like, how have we never talked about this?
We did. We were literally congratulating each other the entire way through the lesson, which just so that listeners know, is obviously available in our curriculum, but now we have the Less Awkward You, which is the parent and trusted adult special course available through our membership. And you too can get access to essentially the same curriculum that we provide for schools, just written in a way that adults will relate to and find interesting and intriguing. And that this personal health lesson is on the Less Awkward You course as well, because everyone needs to know this stuff. And it's like, it's so straightforward and basic that you forget about it. It's like, it's like tying your shoes. I mean, it's
right.
really,
but it's so important. It reminds me, Cara, of when one of my kids was little and he kept walking out of the house without his backpack on his body. And like, first the challenge was that he didn't do his homework. Then he started doing his homework. Then the challenge was that he would do his homework, but not put it in his backpack. Then the challenge was that he would do the homework, put it in his backpack, but ultimately forget to put his backpack on his body when he went to school. So cute. It was so cute. Oh my God, he was so cute. And so we had a list on the back of our door for a decade, which was like, do your homework, put your homework in your folder, put your folder in your backpack, put your backpack on your back. And like, that's what he would see every morning when he went to school. This is kind of like a more sophisticated version of that list of things that seem so obvious to us as adults, but are often overlooked and under-discussed with the kids in our lives. And it's like the low-hanging fruit in terms of like how to teach kids how to take care of themselves, and not just now, but like well into the future. So if you're sitting here thinking like, personal health, I don't know if I'm going to listen to this episode. I don't know. It sounds kind of lame. I promise you'll finish the episode and be like, oh my God, I can't believe.
I've never talked to my kids about that.
I've never talked to my kids.
Okay, so here's what we're going to cover, just so that everyone's super clear. So first of all, we're going to cover why knowing family health history is helpful, right? And this is for people who are born to parents that they're genetically related to, and also for people who are born to genetically related people, but then move into a different home, are raised by one or more than one people who they're not genetically related to. How do they navigate their family health history? How do they fill out forms? How do they answer questions that they're going to be asked? How do they gather this knowledge? So we're going to cover all that. Then we're also going to talk about the different elements of personal health, because this highly unsexy sounding topic is actually really important. Like, okay, they have social security numbers, these children. When do they need to memorize them? When do they share them? When do they not share them? How do they get insurance information from their parents? How, like, all the different logistical elements of personal health that we all navigate with a little bit of a sort of an exhale, not a relief exhale, like an annoyed, oh, I have to do this form again, exhale. But they've never done this before. And how do they navigate it? And then finally, we will give you very practical strategies and sort of age-oriented tips about what they need to know and by when and how they share this information and when they don't. So it's actually a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff, and you're going to be on the edge of your seat. So let's start with personal health history and family health history, because, there's kids in my house who had surgeries before they ever, were walking, talking human beings. They don't even remember the surgeries they had. They both had hernia repairs. And sometimes I even forget to list it. So there's all sorts of personal health. Cara, what are some examples? I mean, allergies are an obvious one. Asthma is an obvious one. What are some other things that you should make sure that kids actually know about their own health history?
Right. So I want to start with the youngest kids. So I'm thinking about kids who are in grade school, kind of kindergarten through third, fourth grade, fifth grade. The most important thing that they should know is that their health history is their own, but it is not theirs to share. And the reason I say that for the younger kids is it's true for everyone, but at the youngest ages, kids tend to be, they tend to like to flex the things that they know about themselves. I mean, I've taught many a health education class where kids are telling me how they were conceived, and they have a lot of information about it, right?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And I will say, in that context, what's lovely when they talk about how they were conceived, and many times in this day and age, they were not conceived by penis and vagina intercourse. They were conceived, through IVF or surrogate. And that in that setting, it's actually really lovely because it naturally creates a really inclusive atmosphere where all different kids are talking about all the ways. But as parents, you may or may not want that information shared in a class of 30 third graders.
That's right. And so I think for the youngest kids, the most important starting place is there's no shame involved in having a medical history, health history. Everyone does. But to start, it's your information to hold, and then you'll share it with the appropriate people, and then getting into who the appropriate people are. So it's this word we love, this phrase we love, trusted adults. That's who you share your personal history with. It's your parents. Obviously, they are teaching the kids their own health history, but guardians, educators, and administrators at schools often need to know health history, especially if there's an injury or an illness at school. So kids should know it's okay to talk to an administrator at school or a nurse at school or a teacher at school if there's something going on health-wise. Doctors, kids may have questions about their health history, and they should know that they can trust the doctors who take care of them, the nurse practitioners who take care of them, to take the information and hold the information. So that's where I start with kind of that piece. As they get older, the question is sort of, what do they need to know, right? How much? So there are these buckets. So the first bucket is medical history. Is there any diagnosis that you have that is important for you to know about? Some of the most common ones, asthma and diabetes, are exceptionally common diagnoses, especially as kids get older. And these are important for people to know about. I mean, we could spend an hour talking about the list, but if you have a history of seizure disorder, who do you talk to about that? And how do you share that so that in case you have a seizure, you're safe? If you have allergies, how about food allergies where you're anaphylactic, where you can go into shock if you're exposed? We know that the older kids are, the more likely they are to decide to not carry their EpiPen around. They will describe it as a little bit of complacency and a little bit of rebellion. And so, but To whom do they disclose and when do they need to disclose? So medical issues, that's one big chunk. By the way, for serious medical diagnoses that people need to know about, often we pediatricians will recommend that you get your child some sort of piece of jewelry. It's usually a bracelet that has an identifier on it. It might say like, I am allergic to peanuts. And then sometimes there's really cute stuff out there, frankly. And sometimes it'll say like, there's an EpiPen in my backpack, whatever it is. But there are ways to communicate medical diagnoses that are nonverbal. And I think this is really important. And so jewelry is one of them. The next category is surgical, which is different from medical. The kids don't know the distinction so much, but it's always separated on the forms. So I like to separate them and teach them they're a little different. The more surgeries you can remember, the better. In other words, like if you've had a hernia surgery when you were in infancy and you don't remember it and you don't put it on a form, it's not the end of the world. But boy, if it's something that is in the front of your head and you can remember to list it on your past medical history form, terrific. Do you need to disclose every surgery when you bump your head at school and you're seeing the school nurse? No, you do not. So helping them to understand sort of what's relevant and what's not in terms of surgical history, which is why it's its own category. And then the third category, which Vanessa, I think, you can probably take over from here, is family health history. So it's always sort of three buckets on there: medical, surgical, family.
I would add, now these are often separate forms, but not always, are the mental health questions. And sometimes the kids get separate questionnaires. Sometimes the forms or for, camp or school incorporate these questions. But when we've spoken to camp directors, school guidance counselors, school nurses, program directors, they have said people don't share everything with us because they're worried it's going to stigmatize their kid. Right. But that makes it really hard for us to properly care for that child. And we are begging people to be open with us about what their kids' health is, including their mental health and who their providers are and what medication they're on and what their past experiences have been, so that we can just take care of your kid. Like, it's not going to stigmatize them. It just allows us to take better care. So that's a plea from all the different educators and camp directors we've spoken to who are desperate for people to, with trusted folks with positions of authority, to disclose information to those people.
And we're going to get to medication list, which is another set of things that kids need to know about disclosing. But we're using the word form, and that's because we're talking a little bit about two scenarios. So one is sort of what people disclose in casual conversation or when they're hurt and they're seeing someone who's helping them, versus when someone walks into a medical office and fills out a bunch of forms. And so we kind of organize it in the way that those actual physical forms are filled out in a medical office, because the conversations are training for that. So we've got medical history, we've got surgical history. Now we're going to do family history, and then we're going to get into medications. Vanessa, talk to us.
Family history is fascinating because there's phrases that you get asked about that the kids don't even know what they mean. So when they ask you about your maternal grandparents, kids are often like, what is that? Like, who are those people? And so again, things that seem obvious to us, or surname. Yeah. What's a surname? Say my children. So when we talk about health history, part of the work we have to do is literally walking through the language, or DOB. What is a DOB? What is an SSN? Right? So some of it, as we always love to start, is a simple vocabulary lesson. So when we think about family health history, often the questions are not just about the child And the parents, the questions are often about larger, definitions of family. Paternal grandparents, the father's parents; maternal grandparents, the mother's parents; aunts, uncles, right? So then it's like, is it my aunts or uncles? Is it my parents' aunts or uncles, right? So going through all of that seemingly obvious stuff, which is not obvious. And then, and this is where it gets complicated, we may have information about members of our family that has not yet been disclosed to our children. Correct. And so we may have been filling out forms about family history for our children in which we disclose cancers about which our children are not aware, heart attacks or heart disease that our children didn't know happen, eye disease that they weren't aware of, right? All sorts of other issues that come up that healthcare providers really, really want to know. So this is a great opportunity if you have a kid who you're training to be more independent about their personal health history, things like diabetes, where you want to let those other family members know, hey, listen, I'm going to be training so-and-so to fill out their health forms or to learn about their personal health. I just want to give you a heads up. They need to know about your insert health. Would you like to share with them about it, or would you prefer I do, right? Like giving them a little bit of agency in that conversation.
It feels to me also like there's a conversation, and this may be just one standalone conversation you have to have with the kid once, and it's fine. We never say that, but I'm saying that right now. And that standalone conversation is the reason why you need to know the family history has to do with the impact of genetics, genes passing information down through the family tree and increasing or decreasing the risk that some medical outcome is going to happen to you. So there are things that happen because of our genetics, and there are things that happen because of our environment, what we do to our body, what we put into our body, what we put onto our body. And then there are things that happen by just plain bad luck. And having that conversation and explaining those things to a kid can be very helpful and very anchoring. The problem with that is, Vanessa, and for those of you who are listening who are thinking, I have an adopted child, I have a child who was conceived with an egg or a sperm donor, I have a child whose birth parent is no longer living. So I've got a past medical history, but I don't have a current past medical history, or I have an estranged partner who is very alive and well, but is not in communication. I have no idea what their health history is. There are a lot of circumstances in which case knowing your family history is so not an option that it becomes a stressor.
Right.
And we have to acknowledge that for the kids.
Right. I mean, I think I just had a conversation with someone recently who has a kid who's a late bloomer, and she is trying to figure out how to have the conversation with her kid. The child's adopted, and she doesn't have the child's health history. And so some of the reassurances or information we might normally be able to give a kid, because there's a whole pool of genetic data of, relatives, she can't use that as a tool in her toolbox to have the conversation. And that's true of lots of different aspects of puberty, which we'll get into at the end of the conversation. So gathering information. Also, you may have grown up in a family where people did not talk about their health. People did not talk about their illnesses. You may not know yourself as an adult what the health history is of your family, right? Many families kept things very secretive and quiet. And this is a moment, and hopefully if that's the case, you can still access those people and their health history and learn more. But this is a moment to actually gather information for the sake of your kid.
Also, the list, when you go into a doctor's office, that list of past medical history and family history is overwhelming. I mean, sometimes it feels like it goes on for pages, and the words are very clinical, and it's just a lot of information coming at you. And that can be stress inducing.
Yeah.
I know for myself, my mother's father was a very big smoker. He smoked upwards of 2.5 packs a day. And he had a heart attack when he was very young. And I still, with all of my medical training, I know to say, yes, there's a history of heart disease, but I always write in the space next to it, maternal grandfather, but was a 2.5 pack a day smoker, because I know that was his risk factor. A lot of people don't know sort of how to parse for healthcare providers where a piece of information is more or less relevant. It's complicated and it's really stress inducing. So our goal with kids is to make family history not stress inducing and to introduce the content of it very slowly over time. So what does that look like? It looks like when kids are in young grade school, the focus is on their health history, and anything that's truly significant that is sort of a need to know right now thing about a parent who's struggling with an active illness right now. Okay, maybe they have knowledge about that. But really, the family health history is not something that comes up until kids are in middle school. And that is, as you said, Vanessa, very entwined with conversations about a person's origin story. So what are their genetics? How much do you know about their genetics? Are their genetics the same as the parents' genetics? Which is a huge piece of all of this. And I would say the goal is that by the time a kid is in high school, they often won't, out of laziness and just sort of they're under 18 and the forms get handed to the parents anyhow. But by the time they're in high school, they should be able to fill out in a medical setting those 3 sections. What is my medical history? What is my surgical history? What is my family history? They should also be able to fill out the 4th section. And frankly, everyone should be able to fill out the 4th section, which is, what medicines do I take every day? And
what's the dosage?
Oh, this is so important because it's not just prescription medicine, right? So understanding that part of your personal health awareness and journey is knowing that prescription medicines, over-the-counter medicines, and vitamins and supplements are all things that healthcare providers need to know about you. And as kids enter the tween and teen years, honesty about drugs and alcohol, when asked, is also critical, because there's no judgment here. Like, someone can't take proper care of you if they don't know what you're using or smoking or drinking. So this is, it's tricky waters for adults who are looking to make sure that their kids are open with people who are caring for them, but not too open. I don't want you to judge me, and then it's like, but yeah, you've got to be that open and honest. And this is a place where we've talked about this a number of times on the podcast. When a parent gets kicked out of the room with the healthcare provider, why? This is why.
I keep thinking about that scene in Something's Gotta Give, the Diane Keaton, Jack Nicholson, where he's like rushed to the emergency room because he's having a heart attack. And the doctor's like, "Are you on any other medication?" And he's like, "No." "So you're not on Viagra?" And he's like, "No." And then he's like, "Oh, good, because we're going to give you some, I don't know, nitroglycerides, and you could explode if you have taken Viagra." And he's like, wait. So we don't want our kids to get to the point where they're in Jack Nicholson's position of having not shared certain information and then at risk of exploding. And again, I will reiterate the mental health aspect of all of this. When we talk about medications, kids, and I think this is changing, Cara. I think kids feel less shame and less stigma about being on ADHD medications or SSRIs. But again, it's really important for healthcare providers to know all of the medication that you're on and the dosage, and for kids to know that, because they may, be given their morning pill with their breakfast. They may not even know what the label looks like or what the dosage is or any of it. So this is a time to educate them on that as well.
But, it makes me think that there's another reason to teach kids about what to keep private. And that is that some of the medications they may take, particularly antidepressants or stimulants for attentional issues, those drugs have street value. Mm-hmm. And, it's like, there's the shame issue, which I think is getting better. But then there's once someone knows that you're taking this medicine and you have access to this medicine, they may want it. And that puts kids in a really tricky position. So lots and lots of reasons to have conversations inside of your own house about how you all feel about other people knowing your information, and then what you might do in certain situations when people do know what's going on for you. Vanessa, do you want to walk through the non-medical information that kids need to know about their personal health? Because this is, to me, this is the most fascinating part of the lesson. Is it's not the knowing the stuff that you put on those forms every single time. It's that identifying stuff that we don't think twice about because we whip a card out of our wallet, or we just have numbers, baked into our brain, and our kids don't know any of this information.
So I'm going to share what are aspirational pieces of information that we would hope our children would know. This is not me proclaiming that my children all know this information by heart, as much as I may try to encourage them to do it. So I'm right there with any of you who are looking to instill this knowledge in your children. So, for example, again, aspirational, they need to know their social security number, because there are all sorts of forms that they need the social security number for. That is not to be shared with anyone. So they both need to know it, and they need to know not to share it with anyone, because identity theft is a major issue. It's not to be shared with a random caller who they get, a marketing call on their phone. It's not to be shared with their friends. But it is to be shared on official forms for, medical situations and things like that. So that's number one. Number two, they should have a copy of their insurance card, and they should have either a photo or a scan of their insurance card on their phones, so that when they go to doctor's appointments by themselves, they have the card, they have the number, they have all of that. You're going to laugh, Cara. They need to know your mailing address. They have to know the address,
your phone number
at which they live. So the only number my children know is my cell phone number.
Congratulations.
Yes, that I can claim. I know that's the one thing I can claim. I'm not sure they would spell my name correctly, but they do know my phone number. But again, it all seems so obvious. These were all things we memorized as kids, but with the advent of technology, kids don't know this stuff by heart, but they need to know it by heart. So
here's another one.
Yes.
They need to know the name of their doctor.
Their doctor, their dentist, their orthodontist, their therapist, right? Those are all really helpful things to know. Yes. And to remember. Yes. I mean, I'm not even going to be like, they should know the name of of their pediatrics practice, because that's just like a step too far. That's never going to happen.
No. That's not going to happen. Good luck.
And
they get an A+.
What you can do is, I mean, Cara and I, have launched kids to college. We have more kids going to college this year. Hopefully, you've been training them over the course of high school to book appointments by themselves, go to appointments by themselves, fill out forms by themselves, but it's obviously never too late. And you can train them with this information, and you can make it funny. It can be a quiz where you sit down one night over a weekend and say, all right, just like when you were potty training, you got an M&M for every time you peed in the potty, you get an M&M for every piece of your data that you get right.
I'm going to add that if you are filling out paper forms, one thing that happened in my house is, as I was starting to transition that to my kids, and I would say, here, you fill it out. And frankly, it could be for school forms, right? All that kind of stuff. You can outsource the labor to them and let them start to learn this information. But if their printing is illegible, it's an issue. And that just may have happened in my house, where forms had to be filled out a third time because couldn't read a thing.
How about a signature? My kids didn't have signatures.
Oh my God. Both my kids have evolved to have the same signature. Their names have nothing to do with one another, because one made a really artsy signature with this, I don't even understand what it is. It's like a vertical line and a horizontal line and a dot. And Then the other one was like, oh, that's what a signature is? Okay. And did the exact same thing. Has no letters in common in his first name. I mean, I'm just saying.
Yeah. So they have to understand that they have to have a signature for things like driver's license and credit cards. And they actually like has to be
pieces
consistent.
Of art. You can tell them it's for their art pieces. Yes.
Pieces. I'm sure they have signatures for their art pieces, but it has to be consistent because they have to know that people will check their signature against other things.
Yes. So all of these ladder up to sort of, you see where we're going with this, right? Like if you've got high schoolers and you've never asked them to fill out a form, go do it. Like start now. Now that you've got all the school forms going in at the beginning of the year, or whatever you've got, like just hand them off and just say, here, you do this. I will say a number of these forms can now be filled out online, which makes the legibility issue better. Unfortunately, those forms tend to get emailed directly to parents and it cuts kids out of the loop. And so I actually did have in the last couple of years of my kids' school, I had them get on the computer and start filling out the paperwork that reflected them. I just want them to, first of all, I want them to know how much time it takes.
Yeah.
I was so annoyed that everyone, this is the invisible labor that Eve Rodsky talks about, that it's just valued at $0. And it's a lot of labor. And you have so many children, Vanessa, that I can't even imagine how much time.
Well, I have started outsourcing and they sort of look at me like slightly shocked the first time you do it. And you're like, oh, dude, if you only knew how much time I have spent. And part of what I do is when I give them the responsibility and, you have to go through the logins and make sure they have a login and then all that stuff. But I explain why it's important that they fill these forms out on time, like what the repercussions are. So for example, opting out of a college health insurance, using your own insurance instead, it's really expensive if you don't opt out and you get essentially you're paying, for
double.
2 different health insurances. So having that conversation was motivating. It was also
12 times. Yeah.
It was also
12 times
motivating to explain that if they didn't opt out and I didn't get proof of their opting out, that they would be deducted that amount of money from their savings to reimburse me for the fact that they didn't opt out. That was Vanessa, deeply motivating.
When we're done with this recording, I might have that conversation because I haven't found a motivator. I'll add on to that for those of you who are wondering how young is too young, this is not a middle school exercise. Start, making sure they're amassing the knowledge by middle school, but the actual form filling out, I would say, it's really as they get into high school. Not that they can't, but like the number of errors, you have to check their work here. You have to make sure that what they're filling out, and frankly, the language is stacked against them. So, for instance, when vaccination forms are turned in, sometimes the brand name of the vaccine is used on the list you might get from your doctor's office to show what you've had. But the type of the vaccine is what they're looking for on the vaccine form. And unless you've been trained in medicine, you have no idea how one translates into the other. So this is a team effort here, and it's a slow handoff. It's not, you're not passing the baton quickly. I think where we should land is 3 practical strategies that we can give for once you have the information, how do you handle it, right? So this applies to kids of all ages, whether the information is verbal or whether they're older and more sophisticated and they're starting to do the form filling out themselves. The first practical strategy I'll share is when in doubt, don't give it out. So this is personal information, and personal information can be weaponized against you, especially as you discussed Social Security number. So Social Security number can be the key to all sorts of things, starting with your bank account and your credit card. And we hear about data breaches all the time, but kids need to understand why their Social Security number does not get handed out willy-nilly. And even if someone calls, there are all these great social media posts that walk people through how to suss out when someone is scamming you. So like if someone calls and says, I want to confirm your name and address, one trick is for you to say, great, why don't you tell me my name and address, right? But don't hand out your personal information unless you can trust that recipient.
Yeah. I mean, related to that stuff is how to distribute it. So you don't want to email this stuff. And often, doctors' offices and other medical providers are bound by HIPAA. And so they're very careful, usually, about not asking for forms to be emailed, that there's a secure portal where you submit forms, or they do it in the office. But kids need to understand that, this stuff is all private. That's true of school forms. That's true of other forms that are going to be filled out, but also texting information about yourself, texting your social security number or things like that.
A credit card
information. So always best to get on the phone with someone who you know who they are, to give them that information. And they may not know that the first time. And so this is something where you can't assume they understand the importance of that.
Well, getting on the phone means something very different generationally. So
right.
There's that.
And also splitting up, there may be something that you email, but then there may be something else that you text, so that the information is not all together in one place. And it's harder to steal that data because it's being shared over different technology platforms.
That's right. And the last practical strategy is something that you said earlier about mental health that really applies to all elements of health, which is, even though you want to keep a lot of this information personal, you must share it when appropriate and necessary, right? That you'll get better care if healthcare providers and mental health care providers know the background information. So this is a balance, and it's complicated. And it's a series of really interesting conversations to have with the kids in your life. What can and can't you share, and why, and how do those thoughts evolve and change over time? And how do they change based upon sort of where you're at in your own personal development and where the world is at in terms of being able to talk about any of these things?
Yeah. So this was a broad conversation. I mean, the big topics where this comes up in puberty are things like, when a kid might hit their growth spurt, when a kid might have their first period. As we've talked on the growth spurt episode, how tall, like what's the family history and height if there are people who are no longer alive. Kids are looking for a breadcrumb trail to understand where they're going. And there are so many ways in which we can't predict the timing or the outcome. But in this case, there are genetic factors. And I think scientists are only beginning to understand the relationship between the genetic factors and being able to predict aspects of puberty. But those are some things where we do have some data, and having conversations with kids, not just about the actual health history, but also what it felt like at that time, how your own parents addressed it. And again, to reiterate, for those people who do not have that information because their kids are adopted or conceived by sperm or egg donor, or they were fostered and then adopted, there's all sorts of reasons. You just have that conversation, and it's hard. And it would be nice to have more information, but sometimes we just don't have the information at our fingertips.
Vanessa, I'm going to go have a certain conversation with a certain someone. It's been real.
I'm going to make a bingo game with my kids' social security numbers. I'm going to buy a huge bag of candy to incentivize them to actually play with me.
Will they even know whose board is whose? That's really the question.
Do you remember when they were like, don't use candy to bribe children to potty train? And I was like, okay, well, everyone else may not, but boy, those Skittles are really doing God's work with the potty training. I think the same could be said for getting kids to learn about their health history. I think they deserve a little incentivization in this case.
As always, Vanessa, it's been real. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myoomla.com.